Okay, and we're off to the races. So, this lesson is about getting started. A lot of you had mentioned that you have difficulty going from blank screen to something. Super common thing to struggle with. So, let's talk about a couple different strategies. So, I hope that by the end of this lesson, you will be able to recall at least two strategies for getting started. So the two that I'm going to give you depend on whether or not the thing has a user interface or not. So things like the DOM calculator and the Pokemon API, those have user interfaces. Whereas things like Beyonce did not. So let's talk about the user interface one first. So if something has a user interface, especially if you have to build it, draw the interface first. It is so much easier to add interactivity to an existing interface than to build up a bunch of functionality and then try to figure out where it goes on the UI. Let the UI drive stuff. And this is part of a larger pattern that we see in programming. So the UI stuff is like UI's user interface. The idea of a user interface is that this is the thing that the user uses and then sees the results of their actions. So strictly speaking, if we get that right, it kind of doesn't matter what else that we get right. That's what the app is. So if this is the person, and that's the app, and when they put something into the box and they get the thing they want out of the box, who gives a shit how all the rest of this works? So that makes that a really good place to start. Is, all right, well, let's figure out what this is supposed to look like. And so sometimes that is like, okay, well, it didn't give me like a diagram to go off of, or it's not like the DOM calculator where they're already like giving me an interface. I need to figure out what the interface is. So you go through the instructions. I guess this is like a step 0. And identify the parts of the interface. So sometimes they'll call this a content inventory. Okay, the Star Wars thing needs the title, and it needs the year. Does it need anything else? It needs an image. And then all of these are like 4, 6 films. Okay, so like, I mean, let's look at the actual thing and see if we can pull that out of it. Okay, given that the Star Wars fan is on the home page, okay, so it needs a home page. That's something that we can pull out of that. Then a list of all Star Wars movies is shown. So that's the list part of it. All right, well, what is like actually a part of that? A movie listing should look like this when it's generated. All right, so that's where you pull out the movie name, it's the title, it's the release year. Also, check that out. That's going to need to come from somewhere. I don't know where it's going to come from yet. I just need to know that it is eventually there. So okay, I need an ID also. And then more. Okay, fine. I'm going to punt on this. And this is a problem that I think a lot of people have when they're getting started with something. First things first, I just need to get that far. I don't also need to do all of this. I can read through this, but part of the neat thing about user stories is that we're not doing all of the styling or all of the HTML or all of the JavaScript. We're just doing this. So when you find yourself getting overwhelmed by something when you're getting started, make it smaller. User stories are a tool for making something smaller. All right, and so then I have these constraints on it too. That's fine. Doesn't really impact the interface. And that was where the image came from. All right, cool. So I have the content inventory. That's kind of like my step 0 on getting started with something that has a UI. Please ask me some questions about content inventories or like this part of it.
So you're basically at this point visualizing the final product.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that's one of our habits of excellence too. We're going to talk about that probably, maybe this week. Maybe we start scratching at that next week. Starting with the end in mind. That's also one of the habits of highly effective people. But starting with the end in mind, if we can get this part of it working, doesn't matter what else we got working. If we don't get this part of it working, it doesn't matter what else we got working. Trying to visualize that final product, that's where we start. And if the final product is huge, and it usually is, cool. If it can do all of this, that's one useful thing. That's more than 0 useful things. So that's a place to start. And then something like this, I don't need to think about all this at the same time. I can go, okay, I'm going to punt on that until I've done this. Now, let's say that the starter code for this app was just a big list of movies that showed up on a page. And the only part of the assignment was linking to a specific movie. Like, this is still difficult to do, but it's not, it's way easier than starting from scratch. So that's kind of what we're trying to do for ourselves is rather than worrying about the entire project, we're working on little discrete chunks of it that can be done and be a starter for whatever the next complicated thing is.
Can I ask so obviously with like the drawing it out and the Star Wars API that we just worked on, would you have started by, obviously you're starting with the content inventory, which is just the meat and potatoes of what we're doing, and I get that. But if you were doing that project just by yourself, even before the content inventory, would you like draw yourself? You remember the Connectly and like the actual page structures? Would you draw? The wireframe project. Would you draw out what you want your actual page to look like and then work on your content inventory, or start with the content?
Always start with the content, and that's a great question because this is like at the core of design. We want the interface to be driven by the content. We don't want to draw like a pretty picture or shape or whatever and then figure out where the content goes. Interfaces are driven by what their content is. And like you can always tell when something isn't, because they end up being way too busy. They end up being hard to use because they're not being driven by the content. So you're always doing this content inventory first. And then what we're doing is figuring out how we meaningfully put those on a page.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then you do exactly that. You make that wireframe from Connectly and stuff. More questions about this? Okay, so when I have the content inventory, then I need to figure out how to get this into an interface. And sometimes that exposes some other things. Like you go, oh, well, they probably want to know what page they're on. So there's also like a heading. And what I'll do is just what Bryce was talking about. Make a wireframe. Go, okay, if I put the heading here, and then I have 6 of these films that need to show up on the page. And so each of those, so I just make 6 boxes. I know a lot of you were kind of going for this sort of grid. Or that could have been all in a line. Could have been a lot of different things. And there's even design strategy called thumbnail sketching. So the way thumbnail sketching works, this is not part of starting a project unless you are like trying to really design something. You might try doing this on your production website. But you go, okay, I have 6 things that have like those 3 pieces of information. What are some different ways I could do it? So a thumbnail sketch is you try to do as many in like a short period of time. So like if I set a timer for a minute, all right, so a minute on the clock, as many different ways as I can think to represent 6 things. So it could be something like that in a grid, could be all in a row like that. I could do these as cards where each one of them is sort of like that, and then I have kind of those all lined up. You could do something that's a little bit less square. So maybe I do these in a circle. That makes me wonder if I could do some other kind of like interesting mashup of these, like if I split that up in some kind of like awesome geometric way, and like each one of these has all the stuff for the movie, or that maybe that makes you think of like a timeline where each one of those is the dates and they're all spaced apart based on how their things were. Cool, and that's a minute. That's thumbnail sketching. And so then once you've done that, the point is to think as little as possible and just like vomit out of your brain and get stuff on the screen. And so once you've done that, you can take a look at the things that you made and then start figuring out if you were sort of onto something with some of them, or if there's parts of stuff that you could combine. So like this card idea was pretty good, and this timeline idea was pretty good. This is interesting, but like I don't think that those movies have really that kind of relationship with each other. Now, if we were doing the later movies where they've got like Rogue One and stuff, maybe something a little bit more abstract sort of actually works pretty well for that. But really, I think that this timeline thing mixed with this card thing might be a good way to do that. Okay, so like however you get to it, then you're trying to figure out like where this stuff goes. So if I did those as cards, I need to find a place to put the image. So maybe the image goes there. And then the year, I need to get the title and the year. And then the ID doesn't show up on the page. It's just something that I need. So that might be title. And then like a year right below that. Or in parentheses or something like that. But you want to get to something like this, where you've got like a diagram of how this looks. So make a content inventory, like make a wireframe, sketch out the interface, and then implement static HTML. No JavaScript. Imagine that you had this API integration working. You had the data coming back. You had the names of the movies right. You had the years. You had the images. You didn't have to go fetch anything. You just had those. So then you try to make this interface become real just with that static data. Now we're talking about stuff from Unit 1. Just make a website. No external data. Makes a UL with 6 LIs in it and just hard code out all of that stuff. What that tends to do is reveal anything that you missed in your content inventory, like the heading. And you should end with effectively what your final product looks like. So from the user's perspective, like you'd be done at that point. Now, since we're trying to integrate external data sources, like that information is static. And in truth, for something like the Star Wars movies, that's not a big deal because that API isn't adding new data or whatever. But you could imagine a situation where it could. And anytime a new Star Wars movie gets added to that thing, it should show up on your page without you having to code up new HTML. That's the thing that we're kind of getting at with that. So we implement the static HTML on this based on whatever our diagram was. Questions about this so far?
So Kyle, when you're saying static HTML, it's really just, we're saying empty boxes at this point, because like you said, we haven't fetched anything. So it's just an empty box where A New Hope's going to go, or an empty box.
No, not an empty box. So that's so I didn't do this morning, but what I'm really saying is, if I go to the Star Wars video library thing from this morning, and I have this, especially if you're having a hard time getting started, put the things in here. So like a movie listing is supposed to look like this. All right, well, okay, so movie ID would be, oh, I don't know, 1. Oops. And this would be A New Hope. And this would be 1977. And then that image would be whatever. Like, actually write that out on here and then put 6 of them in. Because then they're there, you can style them, you can get the interface working, exactly like you would have done in a Unit 1 thing. Now, then you're trying to replace this with something dynamic. And you can even do stuff like, okay, I'm going to copy and paste this into my JavaScript file so it ends up going into one of those templates, like here. And then, all right, what are the parts of this that change? And then you start swapping those out. That's the like slow and steady way to do this in easy mode.
Sorry, really quick, just because I think I missed a part of that. So once you write it out in static HTML and put it in your actual HTML document, once you make it dynamic in your JavaScript, you went back and deleted it from your HTML?
Bingo.
Okay.
Yeah, and so what you'll see is like you'll have the 6 things that you hard-coded, and you'll know you got it right when that becomes 12 things that you hard-coded, and yeah, then you just delete the static stuff. Other questions about what we've talked about so far? So then the next step is make it dynamic. So that's when you attach the JavaScript file and go, okay, this thing that I've hard-coded into my HTML, where do I get that from? Is that something that I just hard code? Is that something that I pull from an API? Is that something I read out of a file? Figure out where it comes from. In an effort to like make stuff smaller, you can even baby steps that. So like if we had something like this, before we do any of this other stuff, we could have done something like A New Hope is an object with an ID of 1 and a title of A New Hope and a year of 1977. This would be a string. So you do something like that, and then you get whatever that element is, and do stuff like get the thing with a class of title, and then set its text content equal to A New Hope title. All right, well then you start doing that with all of these. Come on. Empire. You go, okay, well, wait a minute. This is getting a little repetitive. So when you find yourself doing something like that and having these like otherwise identical things in here, then you go, okay, well, that's like a sure sign that you need to iterate over something when you're just doing a lot of repetitive things like that. So then you go, okay, well, what are the films that are a part of this? If it's iterative, like list of things should just mean array in your head from now on. What if I put these in an array? Okay, well now they're in an array. So how would I do all of these? All right, well then I would iterate over it and these things that I'm doing each time, I do this in an iteration instead. So it's not a New Hope title, it's really like something like that. Okay, now I found the shape of this. And then, this is all still hard-coded, but this logic works. I don't have to also worry about that logic. Now I can figure out, how do I get this array remotely? So now I just need to figure out where I need to fetch from to turn this from something that I wrote out to something that I'm just using. But otherwise the logic works. That's this baby steps kind of process to this. Where does this stuff come from?
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
How do you know when to use and not use the dollar sign? Like
So-
on your film word, you've got some dollar signs and some don't, and I'm
Sure.
completely confused on that.
Okay, so the dollar sign is just a thing that I do. It's not even very popular anymore, and it doesn't do anything special. It's just a character.
Okay.
Now, I do it on things that are DOM elements, and they're my little note to myself that what I'm working with is a DOM element. So dollar sign film is what came back from a query selector thing. Film without dollar sign is what got passed in here. So that's an object. That's like one of these. And that was a DOM element that I'm going to put the film in.
Okay.
I could have also done this. That's the exact same thing. I just don't like using the name of a data type in a variable name.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. Great question. More about this process.
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I can follow along with this as it's in the whole JavaScript file. So when we're fetching from an API,
Uh-huh.
we're essentially going to be looking at those arrays within Insomnia or in the console log, and that's kind of where we're going to be pulling those from, I guess.
So what you'd be doing, so here's where like Insomnia would fit into this. So if I pull up Insomnia, and I go, oh, I'm trying to work with this Star Wars API. So okay, so I want to see what I get back when I look for films. All right, I get all this stuff. The point of this is that it's giving me a tool for like inspecting what's coming back so that I don't need to write the JavaScript to do the fetch. Now, when I do the fetch, specifically when I make a GET request to this URL and I parse the response, this is what I get back. Insomnia is just a tool for like exploring this without taking a whole bunch of other things out of the equation. So I can go, all right, if I want that array, that's going to be coming back. If I make this request, it's going to be in this results key that has the closest thing to this array that I want. And so I could say, all right, well, a GET request to films is like this, and then parsing something is like this, and then those films that I want, based on what I saw in API and Insomnia, was in results. So then like films is response.results. Okay, well those films don't look exactly like the one that I had up here that I need to replace all this with. So maybe I need to do some kind of transformation on those, where I take each film and return a new object where the ID is the episode ID. Or I could look that up in that one of those maps from this morning. The title is the same as the title. And the year is, use one of those get year functions for release date. Okay, so nothing crazy with this fetch. It's a GET request to that URL, and after I parse it, I get all this back. Well, hey now, once I do that map, films is exactly like what this would be, right? So this thing that was using films, could I not just put it right there? I know that that logic works. If I have an array that's shaped like this, I've already seen that it puts stuff, we didn't actually see it, but I have presumably already seen that this worked as I was creepy, just super slow, coming back from the user interface. Now I'm just, films is just coming from somewhere else. But I work with it the exact same way. Questions? Also, you don't have to get this right. Like, this is a conversation. So if you go, oh man, it isn't really ID though. It's like episode ID. So you start working with this and you go, all right, if that's what I'm going to get back, if I change this to episode ID, what else has to change? But it's a lot easier to work with this stuff when you're hard coding it. That's kind of the idea of that. And so that you're taking things that are fake and hard coded and then step by step by step, making them more real, dynamic, integrated, that sort of stuff. So where does it come from? What can I keep static? How small can the steps be? That's how you get started with something like that. So like in an example of the DOM calculator, where we already have an interface. We don't need to do a content inventory. We don't need to draw the interface. The HTML is already there. So then we're going at this like, how do I slowly make this dynamic? So for example, let me pull up the old DOM calculator. Oops, it's vocab. Okay. So in the DOM calculator, if I clone this thing down, okay, so I got to build a basic calculator. Should do the following. Click an operand or operator button to append its corresponding text to the screen. Wow, that's a lot. How do I get started with such a thing? Make it smaller. How about I click on an operand and then I just hard code something to what the screen is. So like if I'm serving this up, so maybe something like plus. When I click that plus button, I want to see a plus on the screen. It's progress. Gives me something to start with. So I got to figure out a way to get that plus button. So what's a query selector that'll do that? Okay, so I've got that. It's got a class that like a bunch of other ones have. So I can say, well, how about I get all of them? And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The plus button's the fifth one. All right, so if I add an event listener for clicking, let's see, what am I supposed to do again? Append its corresponding text to the screen. Okay, so that means I need the screen. There's the screen. So grab the screen. And do something like screen dot, I don't know, text content equals plus. All right, so if I click the plus button, a plus shows up on the screen. All right, that got me started. Now I need to look back at the instructions. Click an operand or operator button and append its corresponding text to the screen. All right, what about, how do I make this dynamic? So if I'm going to iterate through, so I need all the operators, all, that's one of our like hints that this is a list, collection, arrays, iteration. All the operators, well, what if I looped over those? And for every one of them, if I copy this in here, okay, the parts of this that need to change, that plus button. All right, well, I have, like, that is each of the operators. The event is the same on all of them. So how could I possibly get what the, what that particular thing is? Well, in the event, I think that event has like the contents of the thing that got clicked on somewhere. I don't know where. Let's see. So if I go over here and click on one of these, let's take a look. Is there anything on here that says plus? How about down here in target?
Text content under target.
Ooh. Text content. So I could grab the text content of event.target. So if that becomes event.target, oop, that didn't work. Gave me an object. This is text content. All right, how about now? Okay, there's a plus. Hey, I can get different things to show up on the screen. It replaces them instead of appending them. So what if I make this plus equals? Does that let me do more than one? Looks like it. That's the approach to this. What can you simplify? What can you make smaller? Because if I gave you this problem and said, all right, starting from here, can you do some more calculatory kinds of things? Can you take a look at what was clicked on and what's already on the screen? Like that sort of thing. So set yourself up for that.
Can you explain a little more how you went from having the blank function in there and then putting event in there?
Sure.
Like what's the difference there?
Totally. So this is the thing that confuses everyone. This is a function definition. So like I could have also written this like that without the fat arrow. It will be called with an argument that is the event that caused this listener to fire. It does that whether or not like I keep it. If I don't need the event, like when I was hard coding this, you don't need to have it in declared as a parameter because it's not getting used. If I want to use that event to pull some data out, then I just need to say that I'm looking for it. But like the reason you're having a hard time with this is because you don't call this function. You're defining this function. The browser calls this function whenever that event happens, and it's going to call it with this object. You just don't have to use that object if you don't want to. Also, it's made up. You'll see a lot of people do this. Not in this house. We don't use single letter variable names or programmer abbreves. But this could be anything. The first argument that handler gets called with is an object that has tons of details about the event that happened.
So it's the event listener that's actually causing the functionality with whatever you put into it. Okay.
Ding, 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 ding. That event listener calls this function. You're just telling it which function to call.
So this is why you can create the function above it, and then at the same time, or not the same time, but I guess you can also just call that function below instead of writing it within the event.
Yes.
Okay.
So if this is add function to page or add thing to page and it takes in an event, this can be add thing to page. That's the exact same code. Oops, except with the things that I deleted out. The event listener takes a string, that's the name of the event that it's looking for, and a function that it should call whenever that event happens. And part of the contract is it will pass in this event whenever that happens. And that's going to have things like let's just log it. Come on. Okay, so one of those gets clicked. It's got things like where was page X and page Y is like how many pixels to the left and from the top was like the mouse cursor when you did that click. Things like, were you holding down the Alt key while you did it? So like here, I'll hold down the Alt key, click it. Now Alt key is true. Tons of stuff. And then target is the actual element that fired the event. And this is the exact same kind of element that you get back from document.querySelector. All the same stuff on it. You can even do all the same things. You could set text content on it. You could query it. You can do any of the things that you would do with a DOM element. Event.target is what that is. All that stuff is available on this magic object that the event listener will call your function with. A little bit of a tangent, but probably a helpful one because I saw a whole bunch of light bulbs going off. All right, back to the strategy. Identifying the parts, drawing the interface, making it static, then gradually, step by step by step, small as you can, make it dynamic. That will work with everything for the rest of your career. That is like a generic problem-solving strategy that works great with application development. If a problem's too big, make it smaller. Questions about getting started with something that has a graphic interface?
So one of the things I struggle with is like when I look at it and can't figure it out, like how long I spend trying to figure out if I shouldn't already know how to approach it versus trying to look for other methods or like trying to research.
Totally.
Like, I don't know if that's a question. It's a statement, but.
No, I think I get where you're going with it.
Okay.
I'll tell you right now, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Wrestle with something for about that long. Not an hour, not 4 hours, not a day. Spend about 10 minutes looking through your notes, trying some different stuff, seeing if you can recall it. If you can't, hop in the queue, ask the question. And use that question format that I gave you guys, where it's like, I'm working on the DOM calculator assignment. There's your context. I am trying to get something to append to the screen. That's a specific problem that you're having. I tried the following code and this following code, and neither of them worked. Can anybody help me figure out what I'm doing wrong? Like 10, 15 minutes. Can't get it working? That's the question you should ask. Because like that struggle, that's an important part of the learning process. That's part of what's strengthening the neural network when you're trying to recall something and you go, what is it? What is it? What is it? Oh, it's that one. That's strengthening that neural network when you do it. So that's why you don't want people to just feed you answers, or why you don't want to just transcribe somebody else's code. You need to wrestle with it a little bit. Past 10, 15 minutes though, like you're spinning wheels. We got a lot to do. Ask for help. More questions about this strategy? Cool. I said I'd give you two. Here's the other one. It's a lot simpler. So the other strategy is if it doesn't have a graphic interface, I/O table. Same thing we were doing in that code analysis exercise. So you go, all right, write a function that accepts an array of numbers and returns the sum of their squares. That's a lot. Okay, where do I even get started with such a thing? Where you get started is the I/O table. Go, okay, it takes in an array of numbers. So that's an array of numbers. Returns the sum of their squares. Well, 1 squared is 1, and the sum of all the things in this array is 1. Okay, what if it's 1 and 1? Okay, the sum of all of their squares. So still 1, but now we're summing them, so that's 2. If I make it a little harder. Okay, square is 1, square is 4, and I sum them, so that's 5. Start with the I/O table. That's when you start seeing the pattern, and it's also where you start seeing maybe like unexpected things. So for example, if it's -1, 2, you go, all right, well, no, it's still 1. So that's 5 still. Oh, interesting. What if it's like all negative numbers? Still 5. This is you like starting to understand the shape of the problem. And spoiler alert, this is like all we do at the beginning of the 3rd unit, is like lots and lots of stuff like this. But figure out what the inputs and outputs are. And then similar kind of thing where as you draw out this function, don't even work with the arguments. Just put these in variables, return them. Just return a hard-coded 5. And you go, okay, well, the function's working. I'm getting something out of there. What if 1 is always one of these things, and I'm just adding something else to it? See if you can just make the problem smaller, 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 smaller. Then you go, okay, now I just need to gradually make that more dynamic. Look for things like all, list. Figure out where the things you're iterating over are. When you find something that's iterating, what's the thing that gets done on one particular thing? Like, and you'll notice when I did this IO table, I didn't start with an array that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hell, what if it takes in an empty array? The sum of all of its... Oh, that's a good question. What is the sum of all the things in an empty array? Is it null? Is it undefined? Is it 0? It's probably 0. But like, that's part of what you're figuring out, and an IO table is your best tool for that. These two strategies cover 99% of the problems you're going to run into as a web developer. Questions?
I like the IO table a lot because it helps me put it in perspective. Like we are the we are making the calculator. We
Yes!
are that. So
Exactly.
that for me has been the hardest thing to wrap my brain around.
Yes, that turns into that, and you are the red arrow. You are figuring out how that turns into that. And like, I think that another thing that's it takes a lot of practice to get used to is don't start with -1 and -2. Just like come up with the simplest examples you can and work through those one at a time and go, I know there's going to be other weird cases that I have to handle down the road. What if it's an array with one number? What would I do? Can I get it to turn into this? And then as you slowly add more examples, that's where it like shows the flaw in your design. And it doesn't mean you screwed anything up. You're just trying to work with smaller problems. So you go, okay, this works in everything except for when the numbers are negative or something like that. And so then you just need to figure out how to make it do one little more thing. And like, I'll admit, it's a lot easier said than done. And a lot of times they can go from like empty array with one number to draw the rest of the fucking owl, like very quickly. But this can do a lot to help unblock you and just show you what the shape of the problem is. More questions about this as a getting started strategy? Cool. Go get some lunch. About half an hour. Let's call it 45 minutes. I'll give you a little bit more time. Let's push that whole schedule back 15 minutes. And what's the next thing that we're talking about? Is iterators maybe?
The big picture.
Big picture. All right, 45 minutes. We're going to talk about how HTML and CSS and JavaScript and the DOM and fetching and APIs. We're going to like do a little bit of visualization work on this. 45 minutes. Go have a good lunch. Bye.
Thank you.
You're
Bye.
welcome.